Kim is employed as an engineer. During the year, she travelled 3,000 kilometres in her car for work-related travel, and her employer reimbursed her at a set rate per kilometre. Kim also paid for a professional journal subscription from her own funds. She wants to know whether she needs to substantiate these expenses to deduct them for tax purposes. There are three categories of expenditures that have substantiation requirements for individual taxpayers. These are work expenses, car expenses, and business travel expenses. In general, substantiation is required to deduct a work expense. A work expense is defined as a loss or outgoing incurred to produce work-related income, such as salary income. This would cover expenses such as a salary earner paying for their own self-education expenses or a professional journal. If, however, the total work expenses do not exceed $300, then no substantiation is required. Just a reasonable explanation for expenses incurred is sufficient. Another exception is that if total laundry expenses for the year do not exceed $150, then they do not need to be substantiated. If an employee undertakes travel that involves being away from home for at least 6 nights, then on top of any substantiation requirements, they need to also keep a travel diary. However, for domestic travel, an employee does not need to substantiate their expenditure or keep a travel diary, where the expenditure is covered by a travel allowance, as long as the expenditure is considered reasonable. For international travel, the employee does not need to substantiate their non-accommodation travel expenditure where it is covered by a travel allowance, as long as such expenditure is reasonable. There are two ways of calculating car expenses. These are the cents per kilometre method and the logbook method. The cents per kilometre method involves the taxpayer making a reasonable estimation of the business kilometres they have travelled, multiplied by a prescribed rate. No substantiation is required for this method, just a reasonable explanation for the number of kilometres travelled. This method only allows a maximum of 5,000 business kilometres to be claimed a year per car. The logbook method requires the taxpayer to maintain a logbook that records details of each journey for 12 weeks. The logbook must state whether the journey was work or private, the start and finish odometer readings, as well as the total kilometres travelled. Such details are then used to calculate the business use percentage. This business use percentage is then multiplied by the car expenses for the year. The oil and fuel costs can be estimated based on the kilometres travelled. However, other car expenses, such as servicing costs, need to be substantiated. Depreciation expenses require details on how they were calculated. Business travel expenses are defined as travel expenses not related to producing a salary. These rules would apply to a self-employed person's travels. Under these rules, on top of the usual substantiation requirements for expenses, a travel diary is required if the travel involves 6 or more nights away from home. When expenses in these three categories require substantiation, such substantiation, which will typically be a receipt or invoice, must contain certain details. These are the name of the supplier, the amount of the expense, the nature of the goods or services, the date the expense was incurred, and the date of the document. However, if the date that the expense was incurred is not shown, a bank statement or other reasonable method can be used to prove that it was paid. Also, if the document does not state the nature of the goods or services, the taxpayer can enter these details themselves. Where substantiation is required and the taxpayer does not have a receipt from the supplier, they can make their own invoice. This will be the case where the expense does not exceed $10. The taxpayer can only do this up to a maximum of $200 of such expenses a year. For Kim, the professional journal subscription expense would need to be substantiated as it does not fall under any of the exemptions. The car reimbursement from the employer would be assessable income. She could calculate the deduction for this using the cents per kilometre method, which she would not need to substantiate. To recap, there are a number of requirements and exemptions relating to substantiating work, car and business travel expenses. Keeping records and being able to reasonably explain and/or substantiate deductions are key elements to ensuring that deductions are not denied.